Good evening. I want to welcome you all to this lovely event, actually. My name is Scott Waugh. I'm the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost here at UCLA. They wouldn't let me out of the building without notes that I was supposed to read. I don't think they trusted me not to read notes. So I'll read the first page, and then we'll go from there. It starts a little oddly because it says, "Thank you, Dean Gomez." That's Laura Gomez, who's not here. She's infirm, so she wasn't. This is a special evening for me. First, I have the honor of congratulating Professor Brenda Stevenson, an immensely distinguished scholar in my home department. This evening is also to celebrate the generosity of a great friend, Ben Nickoll. First, I'd like to take a moment to tell you a little bit about my relationship with Ben, and then it has share personal sentiments. I drew a blank there, and I'm not sure how personal Ben wants me to be. So I can only say that I've known Ben for a long time. We've interacted here in New York and all kinds of places, and had wonderful conversations about all sorts of things. And he's opened his home for history receptions, and he's been a great host at dinners. So he's really been a marvelous supporter and friend of the department. If I had to characterize him personally, I guess that what I'd say is underneath that sort of Southern California laid-back demeanor, he's very avid. He is avid as a financier and investor, an avid businessman, but he's also an avid surfer, an avid connoisseur of wine, and an avid supporter of the history department, as his generosity shows in endowing the department with this chair. And I think he's avid in the right way, and he understands sort of generosity, and importantly, as supporting people, not just supporting things, but supporting students and faculty, the ones who matter in the organization and the university, and his generosity goes directly to the heart of that. So I want to personally thank Ben for his generosity tonight, and also to say that it's wonderful to be able to endow a chair and then be able to honor a distinguished professor and distinguished historian at the same time, our friend Brenda Stevenson, the most worthy first holder of the Ben Nickoll Family Chair that I could imagine. Brenda needs no introduction, so you can talk. Brenda, so I'll get personal with Brenda too. If Ben is avid, Brenda is, as you all know, intense. She's intense about her family and her daughter, intense about her garden, intense about her African art, intense about her scholarship, intense about her friendships and her relationships in the department, and above all, intense, I think, about UCLA and the history department at UCLA. She's been an absolutely splendid colleague for many years. To say somebody's just a distinguished historian just kind of puts them aside, but she is distinguished in many, many, many ways. And I think partly she's distinguished in the sense that she's not like some of us drudges, just wedded to the archive, but she's moved beyond sort of her safe zone in the archive to take on current topics, which are important to the community, important to our life today in the United States. And she's been recognized for that. She's won outstanding awards from the Guggenheim, and one that I didn't know about, but the Ida B. Wells Award for Bravery in Journalism for her 2013 book about the murder of Letitia Harens in 1991. So Brenda is many things. She's distinguished, and she is always intense. She's intense in her friendships, and I think that she is a wonderful person to hold this chair because she brings together all the things I think that Ben wants to support when he gave this chair to the university. And the chair itself distinguishes the university, and Brenda brings distinction to the chair. Brenda.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to start with a lot of thanks, okay? So just be patient with me. I am very thankful for this opportunity to address you and to thank so many of you who have been my friends and colleagues and supporters and loved ones at UCLA for the past 25 years. I came in 1991, so it's been 25 years that I've been at UCLA and in the department. Thank you first and foremost to Ben Nickoll and to his lovely wife and their family for your generosity to UCLA, to the history department, and support of my research agenda. And you're sitting here so anonymously, so could you please just stand up for a moment, just the two of you all, and Thank you. This is what happens to our graduates. They'll go off and make a lot of money, and they come back and help us. So thank you very, very much. Thank you to Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost Scott Waugh, who has been such a dear friend and colleague since I've been here, and as a UCLA administrator has been extremely supportive of my research career. Thank you to my close friend and colleague, History Department Chair Stephen Aaron, and thank you to Chancellor Jean Block, who could not be here, but I'm very thankful for his support. Thank you to my teachers and mentors across the years, my wonderful current and former students, some are here tonight. Thank you to Father Paul Vigil, my priest, and St. Timothy's Catholic Church, and all my friends there. And thank you to my wonderful family who came across the East Coast and from the East Coast to see me. First, I'd like to thank my late parents, James and Emma Stevenson, who were just magnificent. May they rest in peace and happiness. To my sisters who are here today, Iris and Beverly, to my brother-in-law, Carlton. I want to thank, of course, and give special thanks to my incredibly supportive husband, James, Dr. James Combs, and my bright, beautiful, smart daughter, Emma, the one with the huge afro in the front. Thank you to God from whom all my blessings flow, and thank all of you so much. So now I'll start. As Steve has told me, I only have 30 minutes, so I'm going to get to it. I hope that doesn't frighten you, knowing that I wanted much more. I have been working over the past few years on two books, a synthesis of the Slade family and a research monograph on Slade women's lives. These combined works allow me to intellectually and narratively engage a large swath of the U.S. South, its topics, people, and time. This talk is a very small part, actually, a small sample of two threads that I follow in both books. I'm part of an article that's going to be published later this year on the expressions and meanings of rituals that are meant to signify moments of profound transition in the life of African Americans and more broadly in the history of the race. So the transition that I briefly engage today is that of emancipation, and the ritual is marriage. So, searching back over the long arc of her life, Dora Franks was clear in her complaints about her bonded life in rural Alabama and Mississippi. Enslaved people were not allowed to create, celebrate, legalize, protect, or ritualize family life. She was thinking of her mother, who had been forced into a concubinage relationship to a male member of her owner's family and who had had 2 children with him without any public or legal recognition. When her mother died, Dora noted, she was just buried in a hole on the property that soon sunk in. She didn't recall a funeral, and there was no lingering marker. Dora's experience as enslaved girl and woman, therefore, was that there were few ritualized events that signified the beginning and end or even the existence of Black life or kinship. Quote, "Us never had no big funerals or weddings on the place. Didn't have no marrying of any kind. Folks in those days just sort of hitched up together and called themselves man and wife." Now, on the surface, Dora Franks' observations might not appear to be accurate. With regard to marriage, certainly some enslaved Blacks in the antebellum South jumped the broom, and some even had elaborate weddings. Still, Frank's comments do indicate a more profound truth about the social identity and status of enslaved Blacks. None of their weddings signified a legally binding marriage contract, and the actual bride and groom freely chose few of the designated aspects of their marriage rituals. Some did not even have the right to marry at all, or to choose their spouses if they did marry. Likewise, it was not unusual for slave owners to insist on certain details of the slave marital ritual that turned the event into something other than what the couple would have desired. For example, a kind of minstrel show put on for the benefit of a white audience. This short wedding scene from Carl Laemmle's 1927 film, Uncle Tom's Cabin, creates quite well through the use of black minstrelsy and the employment of white actors as the slave couple, the white public's perception of black marriage as ridiculous, and by extension, black romantic love, physical beauty, sacred rituals, and cultural aesthetics as ridiculous too. And I hope this works. We shall see. Can we get it to work? Oh yeah, here we go. And while there is little doubt that many of those enslaved people who married, particularly those who did so for their own accord, typically found some meaning and even joy in the events that constituted that they were husband and wife, these rituals were fraught with the profound irony that defined the slave's life, the irony of being both person and property. As the North Carolina State Supreme Court noted in 1858, and I quote, "The relation of master and slave is wholly incompatible with even the qualified relation of husband and wife, as it is supposed to exist among slaves." This court's pronunciation would have come as no surprise to most enslaved people. No matter how elaborate or cursory the marital ritual, enslaved husbands and wives were acutely aware of its devastating limitations. So too certainly were the slave masters and mistresses, who typically did not view the slave marriage ritual as they did their own. That is, wrong slide. I'll go back. That is steeped in romance and sacred rites, replete with legally recognized duties and protections. Instead, slaveholding men and women could regard slave nuptials as a form of entertainment or a guarantee of a new crop of slave babies as their property, as public and private demonstrations of their benevolence, or as perhaps a potent and effective disciplinary tool, since most couples did not risk disobeying their masters, here I am, right, when the consequences could be loss of one's spouse or children. So my talk this evening explores the marital rituals of Black Southerners during and in the next several decades after the U.S. Civil War as a window into the ways in which African Americans signified their freedom. I want to demonstrate especially their performance of public and private ritualized events that demonstrated, among other things, their exercise of individual choice and human dignity as unfettered men and women. When no longer a bondswoman, for example, the same Dora Franks, with whom I open my talk tonight, who complained about having no signifying rituals of family life while enslaved, made certain that her new free status included the markers of respectable gendered and familial behavior that had been denied her enslaved mother. 2 years after the Civil War ended, Dora married Pet Franks. Free Dora, unlike her enslaved mother, could and did choose her own husband, married legally, and bore her children legitimately. Her husband, Pet, noted proudly, "When I was on the Cox place, I met Dora and us married. That was a big wedding and a big feast." As with many others who struggle to define and live freedom after general emancipation, family life as a free person for Dora and Pet Franks meant, in part, the exercise of legal and public familial rituals such as weddings. Unlike those marital performances that had occurred before emancipation, postbellum weddings pronounced to Black families, communities, and the larger Southern world that freed men and women now had a right to choose their own lifelong partners, to create and sustain marital relations, to control the intimate aspects of their bodies, to live together, to maintain their children, and to work for the support of their families, all which had been denied them as slaves. Tiffany Herndon, for example, was certain why at age 31 she was glad when the Civil War ended and emancipation came. For her, freedom was fundamentally coded in a legally united family. Quote, "I was glad when the war stopped because then me and Exeter could be together all the time instead of just Saturday and Sunday." Hundreds of thousands, if not more, couples who had been married while enslaved or wanted to marry after slavery ended did not hesitate to participate in new nuptials. In groups and as single couples, at military camps and churches, saddle shops, schools, and the shacks of their old quarters, they stood ready to take on the delights and demonstrations of freedom and citizenship via legally binding marital rituals. To do so drew a line between slavery and freedom. Post-slavery wedding rituals created opportunities for Black men and women to openly display African-American romantic love and cultural aesthetics. Freedom, they insisted, also meant the ability to profess one's beauty, one's talent, one's emotion, and one's intellect, personal attributes that routinely had been denied, destroyed, or exploited under slavery. Wedding rituals also meant joy, something that was short of supply in the years and decades that followed emancipation. Indeed, the wedding was one of only two family rituals at the 20th century South that brought excited joy to the Black community. W.B. Du Bois assured his audience in his 1909 classic, The Negro American Family. Those who had jumped the broom before emancipation went right to the point of why they chose to remarry after gaining their freedom. They wanted to ritualize their marriages in the manner that free people typically ritualize theirs, not as slaves. Quote, "My mother married at Thomas Pope's place," a former slave recalled, "and he had an old man, Ned Pearson, a Black who could read and write, to marry them. He married lots of Blacks then. After the war, many Blacks married over again because they didn't know if the first marriage was good or not." Charlie Davis explained in similar fashion, quote, "My mammy and daddy got married after freedom because they didn't get the time for a wedding before. They called themselves man and wife a long time before they really married." Willis Dukes was absolute about the legitimacy of his post-Bellum marriage, noting, quote, "We didn't jump no broom neither. We was married like white folks with flowers and cake and everything." Now, as far as Dukes was concerned, because he and his bride shared the same marital rituals as whites, their marriage had to be legitimate. Former slave Gus Clark also was emphatic, quote, "I have had 3 wives. He believed in weddings and marriage. I didn't have no weddings, but I married them according to law. My first 2 wives is dead." End of quote. Mildred Graves recalled that as a slave, her mistress had given her a cast-off dress and, quote, "she stepped over the broomstick, but after the war, we had a real sure enough wedding with a preacher. That cost $1. Mary Reynolds, who had been married by stepping across the broom, noted, quote, "After freedom, I got married and have it put in the book by the preacher." Those who decided and had the ability to marry as individual couples brought serious thought and planning to the manifestations of their marital bonds. Clothing, food, venue decor, audience composition, their vows, the license, the celebrant, and the dance party were all important items to consider in their marital rituals that pronounced free status. Many of these choices also spoke to the aesthetic values and skill that late 19th century Southern Black female spinners, weavers, designers, seamstresses, dyers, quilters, crocheters, knitters, cooks, pastry chefs, hairdressers, and speakers brought with them out of slavery into their new lives as free people. And I'd like to pause here for a couple of moments just to demonstrate some of the skills that black seamstresses, for example, acquired while enslaved and were able to use in order to gain and support their freedom and to pass along to their descendants. So everyone probably knows Elizabeth Keckley here. Was a woman, an extraordinarily talented seamstress who managed through her work to buy her freedom and that of her son. And you can see here she provided, she became the clothes designer for First Lady Marital, Lincoln. And you can find these clothes. These clothes are actually in museums, and one of them is in the Museum of American History. Secondly, Anne Lowe of Alabama was not a slave, but the grandmother of a slave. Anne's former grandmother and mother taught her to design and make beautiful clothing. She became the first black female couture designer on Fifth Avenue in New York City, and 5 of her gowns are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's costume division. Before that, she designed and made the wedding gown of Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. Okay. So both freed men and women believed that the clothing that they wore when they married were important indicators of their new status as free people who had the right to commit themselves to a legally binding and a God-ordained union. For black women, it was also the opportunity of a lifetime to show off their physical beauty, their right to have glamorous feminine clothing, their talent as designers and seamstresses, and to proclaim their moral purity. During the slave era, only white women were expected to dress as sensual, beautiful, feminine women. Slaveholding men, and especially women, carefully guarded this white female terrain. Enslaved women feared retaliation when they felt obliged to trespass. Free women, on the other hand, frolicked in their new freedom of expression, proudly creating images in stark contrast to popular 19th century stereotypes of black womanhood as ignorant, crude, shiftless, morally debased, and physically unappealing. Not surprisingly, even decades after their weddings, freed women spoke lovingly of their bridal dresses. Very few could expect to have special clothing when enslaved, since law, custom, and expenses typically forbade it. Some wedding dresses were long and white. White spoke to the importance of the color as sacred, an indication of status of person and ritual, and generally symbolic of purity in various African societies from which their ancestors came. The color white also was just beginning to be popularized again in wedding attire in the Western world as a symbol of moral and sexual purity after Queen Victoria of England wore white at her wedding to Prince Albert in 1840. Victoria, of course, was not the first British monarch to wear white. Mary, Queen of Scots, for example, wore white when she was married in the 16th century. But certainly Queen Victoria and her daughters set the stage for the late 19th century popularity of white and light beige as the color for the bride's clothing throughout the Western world, as did Queen Victoria's African goddaughter, Sally Bonita Forbes, who on August 14, 1862, married James Labulu Davies, an African merchant of Brighton. The color white was very popular among young women in the United States, as we can see from these pictures from weddings in the 1860s. These bridal trends set in Europe and among the nation's elite and the region's elite, and you can see here Jefferson Davis's daughter wedding gown in 1876. Also influenced the choices of newly freed brides. You might have noticed that not only the dress, but also the veils that they wore were white. So many freed slave brides wore white veils not only because they were fashionable and contributed to the appearance of virginal innocence. These veils, as hair adornment, also became symbols of freedom, since some southern locales and throughout the Atlantic world legislated that enslaved women could not adorn or even show their hair, but rather had to wear it wrapped up in scarves, as we see in these slides. Okay. So these sumptuary laws and customs also affect the style, color, material, and ornamental nature of the clothing that enslaved women and men wore. Beautiful wedding clothing in general indicated that these laws that had historically designated who was enslaved and who was free no longer apply to them. So Molly Horn in Arkansas recounted, and these are I found this wonderful book of paper dolls for Southern brides during the Victorian era. So this is where they come from. So Molly Horn in Arkansas recounted, for example, Mama bought me a pure white veil. I was dressed all in white. So too was Molly Hadnot, who explained that she, quote, had pretty long black hair and a veil with a ribbon around the front. Nellie Smith, a successful cake baker, and was delighted to give the details of her first wedding attire, noting, quote, I wore a dress made with a tight-fitting waist and long full skirt that was covered with ruffles. My sleeves were tight at the wrists, but puffed at the shoulders, and my long veil of white net was fastened to my head with pretty flowers. I was a mighty dressed-up bride. Liza Jones wore, which was very fashionable at the time, a white tarlatan dress with the head, I'm quoting her, with the white hat part that goes over the head and drapes over the shoulders. She's talking about the veil. The white dress and veil, Liza explained, indicated, quote, that you haven't ever done no wrong sin and you are going to keep being good. Beneath their veils, some women had powdered faces, but according to Eliza Washington, she wore, quote, no paint. So free women's fashion sense could vary by their age, generation, previous marital status, locale, religious beliefs, and of course, financial status. Many women certainly could not afford some of the dresses that you have seen, although they often shared or designed patterns to make the prevailing styles. The relative finery of a woman's wedding ensemble allowed her to put on public display her aesthetic and romantic sensibilities, her beauty, her femininity, her class or aspired class status, and her good character. And the color white, while popular, still has some competition among other colors, as we can see from these slides of actual wedding dresses. These are actual wedding dresses, again, worn in the American South during the mid to late 19th century period. Josephine Anderson in Florida recalled that her wedding dress was blue. Blue for true, she said. I thought it was the prettiest dress I ever see. Julia Cole remembered, I had never seen nothing like that pretty flowery wedding dress that I wore, and I had the prettiest hat and things that I ever seen. The dress I was married in was red silk, Susan McIntosh indicated. Now, Julia Larkin, whose financial resources no doubt were more typical, wore a new calico dress. Harriet Jones accessorized a used dress from her former mistress with red stockings, a pair of brand new shoes, and a wide brim hat when she married Bill Jones the year after freedom. And Nettie McCree wore a black silk dress that had an overskirt of blue that was scalloped around the bottom. Nettie's hands were adorned with white silk gloves. For most brides, their wedding dress was the most beautiful they had ever owned. Some even planned to be buried in theirs and instructed people to do so. Wedding attire was so important that brides bartered and sold their eggs, chickens, other livestock, produce, baked goods, and their labor to acquire it. They also really refused assistance in acquiring the various items needed for their proud day, reaching out to friends, local seamstresses, teachers, missionaries, former mistresses, current employers, kin, and grooms for help. Postbellum brides indicated in their assemblage process of clothing and adornment for body, hair, hands, and feet those who were operative members of their communities and kinship networks as freed people. The necessity to beg, borrow, and in some instances, yes, steal wedding clothing also suggests the precarious economic status of freed women, many of whom could not afford on their own this elaborate and costly clothing. Some of this pre-wedding activity indicates as well active economic relations between working white and black women at the time when fledgling local Southern economies were a burden for both. Susan McIntosh, for example, bought her clothing secondhand from a local white woman. The white silk gloves that Nettie McCree wore at her wedding were given to her by a white seamstress whom Nettie often patronized. Now, grooms also placed great importance on their wedding attire. Dressing for the wedding afforded them the occasion to doff their work clothes. You see a young Booker T. Washington here. to doff their work clothes and acquire, if only very temporarily, the look of sophisticated gentlemen ready to take on their patriarchal citizenship role and uphold the contractual responsibilities and benefits of a legal marriage. The image that they hoped to portray was in striking contrast, as you can see here, to the racist stereotypes of freedmen as lazy, irresponsible, and beast-like in manners, intelligence, appearance, and appetite. Although black men typically had greater financial resources than women of the era, grooms like their brides often bartered and borrowed clothing to complete their ensemble in order to make their public marriage ritual a spectacular one that firmly pronounced their free status, their manhood, and their citizenship. Ike Dericoit in Georgia, for example, sported a Prince Albert coat. He was proud of it. He was so proud of it that he intended his children to inherit it and left it in his will. Sam Bond wore a white a tie, a white vest, watch, and gold chain, all borrowed from a local attorney. Nellie Smith's bridegroom stood at the altar in a real dark colored cutaway coat with a white vest. Anderson Edwards also wore a Prince Albert cutaway suit, so too did Ed McCree, who completed his ensemble with a pair of brown pants, a white shirt, and vest. Now, of course, relatively few could afford to dress as these men, given the place of black labor, even black male labor, in the economy of the postbellum South. One bride undoubtedly spoke for many when she explained that her groom's outfit was a shirt and new blue jean breeches. It complemented her new calico dress and their privately administered nuptials. Private ceremonies usually included the couple, kinfolk, a few close friends, and sometimes employers gathering at the courthouse, at a preacher's home, at the bride's residence, or that of a boss or former owner. Now, Josephine Anderson was married at a local courthouse. Betty Kirtlet had a minister marry her at home. A preacher of the local Bethel Methodist Episcopal Church married Sylvia Durant. Elder Williams married Fannie Berry of Virginia. This is an elderly Fannie Berry. But her wedding hardly was a private affair. Fannie, as you can tell by her expression here, she's not a person to be trifled with. She boldly splashed her love of stylish decor, rich food, and folk dance, performing her free status and new respectability for the entire community, black and white, to witness. Fannie held her wedding at night at a white employer's house and was waited on by two white female friends to accompany her down the aisle with lighted lanterns. Most of those in attendance were black, although Fannie credited her white employers for providing the food and the space for the party. Harriet Jones of Texas also recalled with great detail her large celebratory wedding and the vows that she and her husband took before a biracial crowd under a large elm tree after emancipation. Her wedding was officiated by a local minister. Two flower girls held her gowns train. Her rituals drew on both Christian and African folk traditions. So Bill gave Harriet a gold ring, which is a ritualistic luxury item ripe with multiple declarations of the couple's unending circle of love, of Bill's ability to support his wife and future family, and of the great value Harriet was to her husband. At the end of the ceremony, the happy couple was regaled with a beautifully set table covered by a white cloth and decorated with red berries provided by Harriet's former mistress. Harriet's wedding guests feasted on, quote, barbecue pig and roasted sweet potatoes and dumplings and pies and cake. It was at the reception that Harriet's mother presented the bride her wedding present that symbolized their cultural past, a rabbit's toe for good luck. According to Harriet, her mother recited as she handed over the animal appendage to her, "Here, take this little gift and place it near your heart. It will keep away that little rift that causes folks to part." Harriet's mother offered the bride a gentle reminder of her family's cultural past, one of which they had relied on for generations for survival and marital bliss. Bill and Harriet might now be free with the ability to marry in the same manner and hopefully with the same benefits as whites, her mother indicated, but they should not abandon their traditional ways of ritualizing and protecting marriage bonds and black life. This rabbit's toe, Harriet's mother went on to explain, was so lucky that it was worth much more than the ritualized items typically valued at free people's marriages, that is, monetary gifts and wedding rings. This rabbit's toe, she told her daughter, was, quote, worth $1,000,000 or more than all the wedding rings, as a hint to the groom, I'm sure. After dinner, the wedding party, led by the bride and groom, paraded to, quote, Master Watson's, which was her former owner's saddle shop, to dance and dance all night. The dances they performed that night, no doubt, also were reminiscent of their cultural past. Ceremonies and receptions were integral parts of freed persons' wedding rituals. Being able to have a legitimate marriage and the rights that it signified were more than ample reasons to celebrate. Special food, decor, music, and dance were the icing on the cake. Former slave Harriet Gresham grandly married a member of Company I, 35th Regiment, at a military headquarters in South Carolina. Decades later, she recalled delightedly when she, quote, waltzed on the Citadel Green and marched down the aisle of the soldiers in blue in the arms of my husband, and over my head the bayonets shined. Martha Colquitt of Arkansas, quote, had a big wedding at her sister's house and 2 fine dinners given by family members. So wedding cakes, which symbolize the sweetness of the love and commitment between the couple and fertility, were particularly important ritualized food items and the usual fare for most weddings. Cakes could be very elaborately decorated. A favorite was a yellow cake with white icing that had the engagement ring baked inside. Nellie Smith bragged of her special dessert. I think my wedding cake was about the biggest one I ever saw baked in one of them old ovens in the open fireplace. They iced it in white and decorated it with grapes. Bunny Bond's employer donated her wedding cake. Bunny Hartley was the only former slave whose wedding was subsidized by whites. Employers had good reasons for lending a helping hand. Given the difficulty of retaining workers after emancipation, many were anxious to impress their employees, many of whom were their former slaves, with tokens of generosity that suggested they supported those families who were loyal and good workers. Moreover, it placed whites in the position of economic superiority and encouraged the ever-popular myth of Southern paternalism. This type of help, as one might imagine, could be both a blessing and a burden. It indicated how involved former owners and employers remained in the personal lives of their black workforce, and it documented sustained black economic dependency. So let me conclude very briefly by reiterating that formerly enslaved men and women entered their postbellum lives with diverse ideas and ideals for freedom. Most significant for many was the opportunity to have families beyond the abusive and manipulative reach of former masters and the state that had supported the slave regime. To be free meant to have a legitimate social identity that implied taking on the mantle of respectable and respected man and womanhood with its gendered connotations symbolized in part by the ritualization of marriage. The sponsorship role of whites in freed persons' marriage rituals, however, were reminders of the persistent economic marginality of freed women and men. It also indicates the continued dependency that Southern whites had on black labor, male and female. So thank you again to the Nickoll family, to the Departments of History and African American Studies, to UCLA Development, the UCLA and UC administration. Thank you. That was nice, thanks.